Welcome to World Builders Anonymous. Kick that world building addiction and actually finish that novel with your hosts Vito and John.
Did she bring pants? You need those at the gym also.
Yeah, well, no leggings, but not
It's
pants.
close enough.
For girls, I guess that's
Like,
pants.
They're pants.
Yeah, sort of, kind of. What really are pants, John? That's the topic for today's episode. What are pants?
This is where we should start the episode.
It is, yeah, definitely.
John, what are pants?
What are pants?
Let's talk about pants.
Well, I have nothing to crack today, so welcome to the episode.
Oh, that was lame, though.
Yeah, it was a little bit lame. I don't know what to do without something to crack to start things off with.
Crack your knuckles.
I got one. I
Good
don't
enough.
know.
I got a couple.
You didn't like my snap? I thought that was good.
That's fine.
Okay, anyway. Welcome to the podcast, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
It's always an adventure here at World Builders Anonymous headquarters, where we totally are right now. Anyway.
Wow. Okay.
We have just finished another week of writing, and
Yes.
it still continued to be going quite well so far.
Surprisingly so.
And I am shocked, honestly, that this discovery writing kind of tack has turned out to be so
It's
fruitful
been
for
like a
us.
spark that's just helped a lot with the writing process.
Yeah, definitely. It continues to feel a lot more free and just kind of creative, and like things are flowing better than ever before. And yeah, it's been awesome.
For sure.
Anything in particular this week, John? I already have some things I had planned to talk about today, but wanted to kind of check in because since we have not talked a ton about our progress this week. Anything in particular you experienced this week that you wanted to talk about real quick?
Aside from the things we've discussed that we're going to be talking about, one thing that struck me is one thing I've struggled with in the past when I'm writing is when I'm beginning a new chapter, I kind of don't always know where to jump in. So you leave off the action at the end of a chapter, say your character just finds something out, and it's a shocking revelation.
Dun, dun, dun.
And then the next chapter starts, and the question is, where does it start? Does it pick up, a linear kind of timeline, right? The moment after he discovers the thing. Sometimes that's not the best option. Because
Sometimes it's like 2 weeks later.
Right, you want to jump into the action a little bit later and kind of catch the reader up to what's happened in the last little bit, and then move on,
Yeah, and of course that kind of plays into probably a topic we won't get to quite today, but like what constitutes a chapter? Like what are your chapters going to be? Are they like these little vignettes within this person's life and kind of, in this time frame? Or is it like a literal just segments of the story in this one continuous moment almost, yeah.
Right, but anyway, the point is, I've found that with this discovery writing process where things aren't quite as scripted, everything's a little easier for me. And in particular, I noticed yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, I was writing a little portion of the beginning portion of my 4th chapter. And it just like occurred to me, this is where I could start it, like 6 hours later, whatever, from when I'd left off the last chapter. And the scene sort of just kind of coalesced in my mind. And because I wasn't going any particular place other than, the vague idea that I'm going to end up at point B or whatever, I could just jump in wherever I wanted to and start telling this scene the way I saw it in my head without having to worry about, how close is this to where we're going? Or is this like the best thing to fulfill, the overall plot? None of those questions kind of came in your mind. It just allows you to be so much more free and creative with, whatever comes in your head. And it feels so freeing. And I definitely think that's what's contributed to having so much success writing so far.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we talked about just being free form and just kind of coming up with things in the moment whenever we were doing this before with the plotting stuff. But we would always talk about it, and then it's hard to do because you're so tied to what is coming next and that kind of stuff. And not to retread over things we've talked about before too much, but yeah, because we're discovery writing the plot, I do feel much freer to kind of explore those impulses when they come up and not feel tied to something, and so therefore feel like I'm more creative and more I guess everything flows better, just like we said before. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I wanted to talk today about something we did this week, kind of for the first time on these news stories we're doing, and that is how to give critique and comments on somebody else's story when you know that it's their first draft. In this case, we're discovery writing it, nothing's set in stone. How do you give constructive feedback on something like that without distracting the person, without discouraging the person, without being too nitpicky? Like, what are the things you need to pay attention to and kind of call attention to in your comments on somebody else's writing when they're not done with it yet, when it's still, everything's still in flux? Yeah. Which I thought we did pretty well this week. We kind of did a lot of back and forth, both messaging and kind of didn't do any inline comments. I think that's way overkill at this point, even though I love making inline comments. It's like my favorite thing to do, whether it's like a scholarly article about economics or somebody's chapter they wrote on Scribophile. I used to be into that website a lot. And there's something very addictive about being like, oh, you should do this here, and I like this, but I don't like that. I think you should change this. And highlight a whole paragraph and be like, I don't think this works because of this and this and this. I'll admit that that's something I enjoy doing, but that would be completely out of place at this point in time. Basically, what we ended up doing. I think we found kind of a good flow to our comments on each other's stuff. Mainly, I think what's important at this point for us, and probably for anyone at this point of writing, all we want is to know whether we're on a good track, I think. We just want to know if we're going in the right direction. If we've made a wrong turn somewhere, if we need to turn back and kind of decide to go a different direction. And also, I think what's the most important at this point is not the plot, because we're still figuring that out. So any plot-related things, unless they're directly relevant to what we kind of imagine is coming next, if we think it's a line that shouldn't be pursued at all, probably doesn't need too much comment. What really needs comment is, are these characters feeling real and natural and kind of living in this environment, and do they seem consistent? Do they seem like they're identifiable so far? Empathetic, that kind of stuff. And ways in which you can kind of clarify those things about your characters. For instance, in the stuff John was sending me, I gave him like a couple comments and just being, and everything was awesome, but it just kind of occurred to me at the same time that you really need to make sure that these characters are who they're going to be going forward, that pretty quickly we need a solid idea of who they are, and that'll give you, the writer, kind of a much better platform to kind of construct the story when you know who your characters are and what they would do in a certain situation, rather than kind of still being like, well, I'm not sure who this guy is. And
and that arose because there was something of an inconsistency in one of my characters where he was sort of very meek and mild in this one scene, and in another scene he was a bit too bold and abrasive in a certain conversation he was having, and that leads the reader to question, so which one is he? Like, what are you actually wanting him to be? And whichever one he's going to be, if he's going to stray from that, you need to have a good reason for it.
Yeah, because we are extraordinarily good as humans, at least most of us. I was not always this way growing up, especially being very shy. But we're very good as humans at kind of detecting discrepancies in somebody's kind of behavior, and kind of juxtaposing it with the sort of typical quote unquote behavior, and any abnormalities in that jump out pretty quick to us, even when we're reading a character and not just somebody else in person, but for good or bad. That's just something we do, I think, naturally as people, and there needs to be a reason when somebody deviates significantly from that in a story, I think.
And you can do it, obviously. Like, there are occasions that rise up where someone acts dramatically outside of their norm. But again, there has to be a significant justification for something.
Totally,
like that.
It has to be intentional on the author's part. It can't just be like, oh, well, I guess I'll use that now. I guess you could do that, but if you didn't mean for that to happen, then it's a bad thing. If you do mean for it to happen, then it's probably a good thing, as long as you're using it correctly. But in terms of like how a character comes off, as long as it's an intentional decision you're making, that's what I think needs to be called to attention by somebody else when they read your first draft, potentially. You know, that's what they really need to be letting you know. Like, this came off this way. Is that what you meant to convey? Or is this the way you meant to write that character? Maybe it's justified later on, and I just don't have that context yet. But this is, you know, something I had a question about, kind of thing, you know? Like, the grammar really isn't something that's important at all yet.
Well, and you might kind of get hung up on that, but remember, you're going to rewrite a lot of this, and what you're not rewriting, you're going to read 55 times before you're done, writing this thing. You're going to have time to go back and edit grammar and add a comma, have someone read it and critique on that specifically later. Yeah. Right now,
those run-on sentences, and the things like flow. Could I reword this paragraph to flow better and kind of pinpoint what I'm meaning to say there? Yeah, probably, but it's fine for now. Keep the flow going. We want the flow of the creativity, not the flow of the English language right now.
Right. What I think is kind of important is if the story kind of flows together. If the whole thing feels like it goes together and is somewhat engaging. Like, one question I asked my wife when I have her read my stuff is, what does this feel like to you? Do you want to know what happens next? Are you interested in the characters?
Are you intrigued by this kind of breadcrumb I dropped over here? That
like,
kind of thing.
Do you want to know what that meant? Like, are you interested in that? Or did you even notice? Like, that kind of stuff where you want the novel to be cohesive and flow as a whole. Ideally, it would in the first draft.
And that's kind of what I meant at the beginning when I was talking about, we need to know whether this storyline is something that we should even be pursuing. That's somebody as an outside observer can kind of speak to that a lot more than you as the author can sometimes, because of course you're interested because you're writing about it, hopefully. Right. But of course, that's not necessarily going to mean that somebody else is going to find that super interesting.
Right.
And really, we're writing books for other people. We're not necessarily just writing books for ourselves. That's a big part of it. But I at least think that the act of writing and the act of making art should primarily be to influence and to kind of engage with other people. It shouldn't just be this thing that exists for its own sake or for just my sake or something like that. Yeah. And so that's useful feedback to have in the beginning stages of something. Not to the point where it paralyzes you, I don't think, but it's definitely good to know early on rather than later on when you're like, I wrote this 100,000 word thing and you don't think it's interesting. It's like, well, yeah.
I think another important point towards the idea of, criticism at this point in time, I think it's very important to make sure you don't make your reading pool too big early on in the process.
Yes.
Because you don't want a ton of critical voices all at once when you're just beginning something. Because if I sent my book out as it was right now, the first 4 chapters, to a handful of people and asked them to critique it, they would have enough suggestions, because it's such a flawed piece of writing right now. The number of suggestions they would have would be overwhelming, and you just can't burden yourself with that many things to fix when it's meant to be a flawed product. Yeah. I think you should find 1 or 2 people. Like, I have Vito and my wife who will read my stuff right now and give me their honest opinion about it, but they understand the process and they understand the stage that it's in, and they understand the kind of things they need to be criticizing and critiquing. And it never gets overwhelming because it's 2 voices, not 10, and it's only things that would be helpful to me right now.
It's focused feedback. We know what we want to point out in your work because in our case, you and me, we're doing the same thing, and we're kind of along the same journey, and very much kind of communicating all the time about it. Whereas somebody on the outside might not know what we're going for, our goals, that kind of stuff, and not know what needs to be critiqued or not critiqued, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I also read something that said people who seek a lot of critique on their early works tend to never finish them. Yeah. Because if you're asking for a lot of critique on something, it generally means you're not confident in it. And B, if you get a lot of praise, you kind of don't feel like you need to continue working on it.
I was just going to say that. That makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a big part of why I never finished some of my other stuff, because I kind of got the fulfillment I was looking for in those early stages of it.
You kind of scratch that itch early on, and then writing doesn't feel as as motivating.
Yeah, somehow, like the two stories I kind of tried to write after that first one I've talked about before, the first one I ever kind of worked on that I got like 250 pages into. I don't think I ever finished that, partially because I just didn't really know what to do with it, the chunk of it I had, but also because I got such positive feedback from everyone that I showed it to, like my whole family and like a bunch of people that I showed it to, outside the family, and I just felt really good about it. And then it just kind of sat there, and I didn't keep going with it after I showed it to a bunch of people. I think almost because you feel like some part of your brain might go like, oh, well, cool, I'm done. I finished the assignment. I got the grade. Awesome, cool.
Yeah, and it's frustrating because you spend so much time doing this thing. Like I just to get to 4 chapters in this thing, I've spent a lot of hours, sitting in front of my computer typing away, and I'm proud of what I'm doing, and I want to show it to people, but you really shouldn't yet.
And I think it is also good to be aware that we all have this, need for affirmation and kind of confirmation,
Sure.
that kind of stuff. And we all want to be told that we're doing a great job. And, it's tempting when you feel like you are to be like, oh, I should show this to somebody so they can tell me I'm great, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the drive is to kind of put it up on Scribophile or some website like that where people can look at it and give you comments. I know I got into that trap when I was on that website a little bit, both in commenting on other people's stuff, because that in and of itself is kind of a fun thing to do, but not the most productive. And then also whenever I put something up, I would get really positive feedback on it, and I would just feel good about myself and be like, okay, cool. And I would almost write in order to post it there rather than writing to get more progress on my book,
Yeah.
So I think it is important to have just a couple people that you really trust and that you trust know what they're doing and how to talk about your book or your chapters or whatever, rather than trying to get as much feedback as possible early on, because you're still figuring this out. You need to keep the flow going. You're going to interrupt yourself if you do too much of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there might be something to be said for if you're very unsure, if you're even like on the right track, or if you're even, if your idea is good, there's some merit to kind of spreading out some early stuff just to kind of see if it's, even a base to start on. But odds are it is. I think everyone is a lot better at writing than they think they are. By and large, I think, not everyone's good at writing. But generally, people can understand the narrative and at least make an attempt to put it down. And then at that point, you just need to work on it and practice and get better.
Yeah, and maybe it's good to show it to a couple of non-writers even, at the early stages,
Sure.
so that they won't get bogged down in kind of how they know a phrase should be, paced or something, or technical aspects of writing. They're just kind of going purely on how does it make me feel? How do I like it? These sort of gut reactions that you kind of want more from an early piece of writing like that.
That's why I asked my wife, like, what does this feel like to read? Because she's a very experienced in critiquing scholarly writing. She was a writing tutor in college, so I have to she has to tone that down a little bit to read my early stuff, because she's itching to kind of point out my run-on sentences. No, you misused a semicolon there, and she loves doing that. But she'll tell me if it feels good, and she'll tell me compared to my other ventures, if she's how badly she's wanting to know what happens next, and if she wants to know more about these characters.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's encouraging when with the current story I'm working on now, she's more interested than the other ones I've done. So
unless any of you think that our wives would be too placating, be like, oh, it's great, honey, or whatever. Neither one of them are like that. They're very good at giving good critique. And
I think nothing will make my wife happier than to print out my work in progress, give her a red pen, and tell her to do whatever she wants to do. Oh, she'd be so happy. She'd run out. She'd need another pen. She'd bleed that one dry.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
Which is that's an invaluable thing to have.
Yeah, you want people
a
to
little
give
bit later down the
feedback,
process, especially once you're looking to getting the nitpicky stuff done. That's an incredibly valuable thing to have.
Definitely, yeah. And my wife is also a really awesome resource because she is a writer, but she's in a different format completely. Like she loves books and novels and that kind of thing, and she's read them for her whole life, that kind of stuff. But her primary thing is playwriting and screenwriting, and so it's completely different format that doesn't follow a lot of the rules, quote unquote, that novel writing does. And so she can really workshop story ideas and kind of characters and those sort of bare bones like storytelling concepts, rather than whether this chapter is a little bit long or something like that as much.
Exactly. Yeah.
So she's a great resource as well. Someone who's super creative and a storyteller, but not a novelist or writer in that sense. She is a writer, but not a novelist. But yeah, I guess the point is, just take a few people who you really trust, whether they have different areas of expertise, whether it's technical writing, storytelling in a different format, or just someone who has a good appreciation for stories and characters, and get some basic, feedback from them early on. And incorporate that going forward. Things you can incorporate going forward being like, how is this character feeling? Is this an engaging plot line? How did this come off? I was going for this. How did it come off to you? That sort of thing, I guess. And you don't get too worked up in how can I go back and change what they commented on necessarily. More focus on how can their comments help me going forward in finishing my first draft.
Right.
Yeah. Excuse you.
Excuse me.
Anything else related to that you wanted to talk about, John?
Oh, I was just going to say, if you guys would like some basic feedback on some of your stories, feel free to send some stuff to us.
Yeah, we're not that famous yet. we have time.
No, at most we're going to get like 2. So feel free to send us your works in progress, and we'd love to read through them and touch base with you and talk about them.
Yeah,
we're not reading stuff.
We're not at the point yet in our careers with the podcasting or writing thing yet where we're like overwhelmed with people wanting us to read their stuff or anything. It's still a cool thing for us if somebody were to do that. So we would definitely be open to doing something like that if that's something anyone would find helpful, having a couple of sets of eyes on something. So yeah, feel free to send us some.
Even if there are a couple sets of very silly and under professionalized eyes.
Yes, very amateur eyes, but very
and in my case, ones that don't work very well.
Mine either. My eyes are terrible.
No. So between us, we can set one pair of eyes on whatever you send us.
It's kind of like one pair. Anyway. Now, John, I'm having a mind blank out here. I was saying something to you earlier today, something else we wanted to talk about today. Do you remember what that thing was?
Was it something to do with setting the tone for characters?
I think it was. I think we kind of covered it a little bit already. But let's
talked about
let's kind of gloss over it real quick, though. I think, basically what I was telling John about his work that I had read earlier this week that I already mentioned, really make sure that your characters are solid. If nothing else, know who they are, what they want, what their goals are, how you want to change them. Through the story and those sorts of things. I'm finding that that's one of the most important things for me in kind of letting the story continue to flow. Because even if I don't know where the plot's going, I want to know where the characters are going and what their story, kind of roughly speaking, is. Because that's the whole point, the characters and their stories. The events in the world outside of that should all be serving that story anyway. And I think that's a big part of why this has been helpful so far. But in order to do that, you do need to have a very clear idea of who they are and why they are that way. And
when you're discovery writing, it kind of feels like the first few chapters are sort of a playground for you to establish those things to yourself. Like you're kind of, in my case, I'm discovering the setting a lot as well as the plot and the characters. So with everything I do and write, it's sort of teasing out what those themes and themes and tones are going to be. My main character, is he going to be, this kind of meek, shy, easily intimidated guy, or is he going to and grow into someone who's more bold and more world-wise, or is he going to kind of be a little bit rough around the edges more so and kind of develop into a gentler person over the course of the plot? What's the baseline and where do you want them to go? And you have to kind of feel that out for every character and for the plot and the tone as a whole. But the important thing in those early chapters, in that sort of playground period, is to find what you want in those. And once you find it, and you're sure you want that, to make sure you stay consistent.
Even
like we said,
even in the first draft, not necessarily because it's going to affect the final novel, word for word, the words on the page, but because it's going to affect your flow of the story itself and kind of your, I guess, experience of writing it. And that's one of the...
And your understanding of the characters in the first place. Because I think you need to understand your characters in order to write them well. And if you can't, get a handle on what they're actually like, then you don't understand them. And then your portrayal of them isn't going to be complex or intricate at all. It's going to be very bare bones. And there are books I can think of where the characters didn't feel very deep and interesting. And I can nail that down sometimes to them not feeling like consistent characters. I don't feel like I know them because I can't predict their actions at all. They're just going to do things that have nothing to do with what they've done before.
Or when you don't predict their actions, it's not because, like, I just didn't know what he was going to do. I don't know who this person is. It's because, oh, man, I really wanted him to do this, but I kind of see why he picked that. And, I really was rooting for him to make a better choice. But, that makes sense. Old so-and-so making mistakes. Or
as much as I kind of don't, I was very unfulfilled by the relationship between Aragorn and Arya because of the way it ended in the Aragorn or the inheritance cycle. I appreciated that the way they interacted with each other remained consistent throughout the whole thing.
I don't know if it was just because we were
most part.
like hormonal teenagers, but that was a very compelling romance arc for me.
It was. I always felt like Aragorn was never quite savvy enough to approach Arya the right way.
Yeah, it made sense why
she was always kind of too aloof to really recognize her feelings for him. Like, and that remained consistent, and you always wanted it to change, and it never did.
Yeah. But it was, that was well done. That was a good example of that, I think. Yeah, for sure. I know I sometimes, this will be the last thing for today, but I know I sometimes struggle with kind of reconciling where I want the character to get and where letting them be where they are in the beginning. And by that, I mean, when I'm writing like the first chapters, even this time around, even though I've kind of gone through these characters in different scenarios and different forms for a few years now, and I have a pretty good sense of who they are. Even now, I have a hard time letting them be in their starting state because I want them to be perfect. Even you were saying, I got the impression that you thought maybe they loved each other too much. Like this family I'm writing, like they might like could do with some more friction and tension in the beginning, even if there is this undercurrent of them, of having a lot of affection for each other. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do more than just like, oh, this is a perfect family who just loves each other unconditionally and everything's great, Yeah. And so it's hard for me to let that happen for some reason. Maybe I'm just not good at writing it because, we had a pretty great family experience growing up and it's kind of hard to imagine it any other way.
Curse our wonderful upbringing.
Curse our wonderful, amazing upbringing and families. But yeah, kind of letting the characters be in their unrefined state in the beginning of the story and letting them have that arc. I guess let me back up. Letting them be in that unrefined state in the beginning of the story is what's going to give them that satisfying arc to give them a place to go. Yeah, exactly. So I have to keep reminding myself of that for sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyway, we should probably wrap up. Any final thoughts? Any last words?
Find us on all the social media platforms, including Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All of that is at World Builders Anonymous. You can email us at wbapodcast@gmail.com. Find our website, worldbuildersanonymous.com.
Leave us an iTunes review, and like we said, we're open to having a look at any chapters or stories or drafts or anything like that you guys would be.
Shoot us an email.
Yeah, shoot us an email. We would love to do that for you guys and kind of interact with you in that way. That'd be kind of cool. Maybe if one of our 2 Irish listeners would want to do that. I'm keeping track of Irish listeners for some reason. It just doesn't make any sense. We have such a good following so far, like relatively speaking, in all the other like English speaking countries, but in Ireland for some reason it's just not happening. I'm not sure why.
Ireland, represent.
Yeah, come on guys, let's make this happen.
Don't let the British beat
There's
you.
There's more Italians listening to us than Irish people. Whoa. Anyway. Okay. Well, now we're definitely not gonna have any Irish listeners. Gosh.
Sorry. We need to end this.
Too soon. Anyway, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week, maybe.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
This show is sponsored in part by Audible. Visit worldbuildersanonymous.com/audible to check out what the guys are listening to right now and to receive a free audiobook.